Hello, everyone. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to a conversation with my friends and colleagues, David Brown and Amy Concannon. David is the former curator of historic British art at Tate Britain, and Amy is his successor. And with James Finch and Sam Smiles, they are the curators of Turner's Modern World, the exhibition which, as we speak today, is on view at the Kimball through February the 6th. We've invited the two of them to talk a bit about the themes that are in the exhibition and the inspiration for it and the historical facts behind Tate and Turner, the reaction that the public had in Great Britain to the exhibition, et cetera, et cetera. So a chance to talk this afternoon or today with our colleagues from the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome. Welcome, David. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure, George.
Yeah. David, I think you are going to get started with a few remarks about the genesis of the exhibition.
Well, Amy and Sam and I made an exhibition a few years ago called Late Turner Painting Set Free. And in the course of that, which really just covered the last years of Turner's life from the point when he turned 60 years of age. So it was really an exhibition about the late work. We became, I think, increasingly aware of just how important modern and contemporary subjects were in his work, and that perhaps in the way that people think about Turner and look at him, they'd been rather neglected. And of course, you know, up to a point that may seem surprising, because anyone who knows anything at all about Turner will know that he was the first artist to paint a railway train in a serious exhibition picture, that he painted great paintings like the Fighting Temeraire in London's National Gallery that show the transition from the age of sail to the age of steam. And so perhaps in some ways it's normal to think about him as a painter who painted modern subjects, but we became aware really that those major pictures that are so well known have rather sort of taken over the narrative and have tended to hide the vast amount of work that he did thinking about other contemporary themes, be they military, political, social, scientific, technological, and that in painting all these things and trying to work them together into a sort of coherent representation of the time in which he lived was really something quite unique. And it's impossible, I think, to think of another artist of that period who was doing quite the same thing across such a broad spectrum. So we thought it was time really to try and pull all these strands together, to put together an exhibition that worked them into a series of sort of thematic rooms. And of course, you have these ideas, you never quite know how they're going to play out, you never get all the loans you want, you don't think you're going to hit a COVID pandemic in the middle of everything. But nevertheless, I think we did manage to pull together an exhibition, not quite the one that we originally had in our minds. And I think you in United States have the advantage of being able to include the pictures that we had hoped to have in London but couldn't bring over because of the pandemic. So I think in a way you probably have a better and more comprehensive iteration of the show than we had in London.
Well, that's awfully flattering of you to say. We were just so sorry we couldn't actually be at the opening of the exhibition in London in 2020. And we're sorry that you couldn't be at the opening of this exhibition here in Fort Worth. But it is a great success. I want to announce to everyone who's listening, and everyone who has seen the exhibition is just bowled over by it. It's absolutely, absolutely fantastic.
Well, we have seen the sort of virtual walkthrough, the video walkthrough, and I think Amy and I feel it looks absolutely spectacular and an absolute triumph. So many congratulations to you for making it look so beautiful. But I think having sort of had this idea, we thought really what extraordinary times Turner lived in. They were volatile, they were transformative, there were vast changes taking place across the whole spectrum of life: political, sociological, scientific, technological, the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, sort of triumphing in the spread of steam power to so many aspects of life that were transforming everything: political change, political reform, the aftermath, of course, of the French Revolution and its consequences right across Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, the rise of Britain as an economic and imperial power after the wars ended. Not, of course, an outcome that could have been predicted at the time. Britain and its allies could easily have lost to Napoleon and become kind of sub-territories of a French empire. So the background to Turner's life was extraordinarily unsettled and unstable. It was full of progress and excitement, but it was also profoundly disturbing. And so we wanted to ask ourselves, how is that reflected in his art? And consider how extraordinary it was that really Turner was the only artist, certainly in Britain, to concern himself with these issues. Many other artists simply turned away from them. And the training that Turner had at the Royal Academy was such as to discourage artists from painting contemporary subjects, to think about history, or if they wanted to make money, to paint portraits, to paint landscape in perhaps a rather idealistic or nostalgic way, as perhaps Constable, Turner's great contemporary, did. Whereas Turner treated landscape and topography, which was very important for him and not a minor art at all, he turned that into a medium that was flexible and responsive enough to accommodate a vast range of contemporary impressions and reflections. So really the show tried to pull these different strands and aspects together into some sort of coherent narrative, and of course whether we succeeded or not, others must judge. There were some good reviews in the UK. There were some also quite sniffy ones, which felt really great theme but wrong artist, as if there were other artists who somehow did what we were trying to show Turner was doing far better than he did. If that's the case, I would love to know who they were. Certainly in Britain, maybe Géricault, maybe Delacroix, in Liberty at the Barricades, but after all, Delacroix hardly ever painted any contemporary subjects, although he was a great contemporary artist of his period. Perhaps Goya, but British artists, no. I think Turner was unique, and we hope that comes across from the exhibition.
It's true. Of course, Turner lived into the great age of cast iron, shall we say, and steam and speed, in the way that these other artists didn't. But I don't think Goya or Constable would ever have decided to paint a railway train or a factory had they lived long enough to do so.
The other thing that we ran up against, which was something that we thought a lot about in late Turner, was the rather reductive effect that Ruskin's analysis of Turner has had on subsequent estimations of his work. After all, Ruskin wrote his famous book Modern Painters, in which Turner is the great hero, but he based his analysis of Turner as a contemporary artist very largely on his painting of nature and natural effects, which of course are not time specific. They are enduring and long lasting and cut across many generations and eras. And when it came to Turner's most contemporary subjects that involved a train or a steamboat, by and large, Ruskin didn't like them. So on the one hand, he says Turner is the outstanding modern painter, but he didn't like his modern subjects, which is an extraordinary paradox, and I think has been very damaging in the way that Turner has been interpreted. And it has tended, I think, to make his contemporary subjects and the range of those contemporary subjects underappreciated as compared to perhaps his pure landscapes or his historical paintings, and that's something that we were trying to address and perhaps hopefully correct.
Well, it's an extraordinary accomplishment, what you've done, the range of themes and ideas that our public has encountered, many of them unfamiliar to a public in the United States on this side of the Atlantic. We've done our best to give the backstory, if you will, behind some of the issues that were so critical to Turner, political reform, let's say, for instance, as one of the aspects that's seared into every Briton's sense of history, but less familiar to our audience, but so important to Turner's way of interpreting the world. Amy, tell us some of your thoughts about the exhibition.
Well, thinking about political reform and picking up on actually what you say about introducing these themes to an American audience, it was very important for us too that we embedded that sense of resonance and relevance between Turner's times and our own time.
Yes.
We live in quite a politically volatile time ourselves. We live in a world that is in which the environment is changing, and humans' effect on the environment, which all began, the Industrial Revolution really rocketed all those changes that we're now really, really feeling the effects of. We wanted to bring out these very live and these very volatile human themes between Turner's time and our own.
We would say hot button issues, yes.
Hot button issues, and indeed. So, for us, there were moments of discovery in terms of, when we were introducing visitors to various works in the exhibition, what really hit home, and in the comments that we received, it was really interesting to see just how excited people were about that past. That seems, to David and I that study this period all the time, it all feels very familiar territory. But then, to people that don't inhabit that early 19th century world, it is fresh and it is exciting. So I hope your visitors will feel the same.
Yes. I believe they have already. It's in choosing which works to talk about frequently for the exhibition, we have in fact highlighted some of the ones that deal with issues of what we would call nowadays income inequality, the problem of poverty and the difference between the rich and the poor, the whole issue of the Industrial Revolution, which begins in polluted London in the 1830s and takes us into a climate change in the early 21st century. So we're very much aware of the topics that Turner touches on. Well, the problems, shall we say, that haven't gone away.
No.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a good moment from which to start talking about the themes of the exhibition, I think.
Do please.
Shall we begin? Okay. Talking about the kind of key issues of our time having roots in Turner's time, the first section of the exhibition we really conceived as a way to root visitors in Turner's time and really kind of introduce the things that were changing and the things that were changing quickly. So entitled Signs of the Times, this is where we introduce through the works some of the icons and the signs and symbols of the modern era that Turner lived through. And, what has been fascinating for me personally is to see this is a special exhibition in that it takes a continuous theme right from Turner's early life to the very end of his career. And it's quite rare, actually, in various Turnerian studies or Turner exhibitions to have such a focus on the early work. And I think it really comes through as very important in this particular theme. So we have here two works which really show that in a kind of industrial sublime visual language what the impact of the Industrial Revolution was on the British countryside. You know, you had the opening of quarries, you had the opening of mines, you had the building of kilns radiating huge heat, great energy, kind of mass building projects of factories and all kinds of infrastructure that just wasn't there before. And Turner, taking his cue from a couple of elder artists, Royal Academicians, Turner went out into the British countryside to find these subjects. This was in part circumstantial. Normally a young artist who's seeking to make their name in landscape or in any genre really would seek to go early on in their career to Italy to find, you know, to see the great classical sculptures, to go to the Roman Campagna and to really soak up the kind of, you know, the hotbeds of visual art as had been, you know, become legend for young artists. But all of that world was cut off for Turner by the French Revolutionary and then the Napoleonic Wars. So he had to find a different route into his subject. So he went out to the British landscape and toured and found, we think and we conceive in bold moves, found ways to tell the story of a British landscape that was both referential to its past, but also to, you know, the very hot burning presence, as you can see in this, the vision there of Llanstefan Castle by moonlight. You get the castle in the background, and then you get the kiln in the foreground. That combination of history and modernity is something that we'll see throughout the exhibition. And in terms of the visual language that he was using, the you know, the aesthetic theories of the sublime were fashionable at the time. So visitors to Royal Academy exhibitions would by this point have been quite used to seeing these dramatic juxtapositions of dark and light and of feeling that sense of foreboding and dread. And it was a sort of scintillating, a kind of, you know, almost like watching a horror film in a way. You have that sense of drama and dread and suspense, but these were very real things. So they could be sending out messages that were questioning viewers, making us think, is this really good for the world around us? Is this really good for the people who are working in these conditions? I mean, one of the special things about Tate is that it is home to the Turner bequest. So throughout the exhibition, your visitors will see many things from the Turner bequest, which is the body of work that remained in Turner's studio the day that he died. And after a 5-year legal battle, eventually the whole contents of Turner's studio were gifted to the nation. So not just the finished oil paintings, but the unfinished oil paintings, the sketches, the studies, the watercolors, and especially the sketchbooks. So we have this remarkable record of Turner's thought processes and experiments. And this for me is one of the standout exhibits in the exhibition, because it's, you know, when your visitors will see it, they'll see that it's just, you could hold it in the palm of your hand, but yet it's so small, it's so diminutive, but it has a very, very powerful impact. It's also an unusual subject for Turner. You know, we think of him as a landscape painter out in the open, you know, big blue skies, framing trees, but here we see him in quite claustrophobic conditions of a workshop, a forge making anchors. So he's inserting himself into new and challenging environments as a young man. But also there was a patriotic edge here to these studies. As David talked about, the Napoleonic Wars is really something that you can't escape in this exhibition from beginning to end. It comes through so many of the works, and this idea of Britain being industrious, Britain being productive, Britain being able to stand on its own 2 feet was a very comforting notion and a very patriotic one at a time of war. You know, anchors for the naval ships that would defeat the French in battles. So it you know, all these themes of new industry and war tied together. So also in this beginning section, we see some of what modern Britain looked like to Turner. And this is one of my favourite works in the exhibition because it's a chance to really get in close and be part of a crowd in 18th century Britain. It's a fair at Wolverhampton, which is in the Midlands and in England. And there's all sorts of activities that Turner notes. And remarkably, you know, towards the end of Turner's life, this fine detail and the fine inscription of words and characteristics of people in particular. Sometimes that is lost, but here it's very, very present. So you can see a jester, you can see a puppet show, you can see a stall selling nuts, for example. So it's really one to get up close to and feel part of Turner's world. We'll move on to a section entitled Homefront, again, redolent of war. This section really focuses on the ways in which Turner started to think about how to talk about modern Britain in bigger oil paintings, moving forward in his career. Greenwich was one of those famous viewpoints, and here he depicts the Naval College, so again an important site in terms of warfare at Greenwich, and then you have the meandering Thames winding its way to, on the horizon, St Paul's Cathedral, which is bathed in sunlight. There's all kinds of comments there about how strong and how glorious London is. But then at the same time, there's the question of the building up of smoke and pollution. So Turner exhibited this with that theme in mind. But similarly, we were talking at the beginning about Turner introducing questions for his viewers about really, who were the good guys in society, and were things really at all as good as it might seem. And this is one of the works that we think Turner was beginning to show that questioning nature through. So we have a view of Windsor Castle, and in the foreground, a field in which workers are ploughing up turnips, a crop which King George was particularly interested in, and had King George was famous for his kind of interest in agricultural developments and the more intensive farming that would fuel and feed a growing Britain and more prosperous Britain. But then when you look closer at the figures, you think from King George's interest in agriculture that this would be a very happy environment in which to work. But the way in which Turner has depicted some of the figures makes you think that he's really wanting you to think about the poverty that perhaps befell some of those workers and the conditions in which they were worked, very, very difficult conditions. So it's one of those works that has a sort of double meaning. But then this is a very different Britain entirely. So we've come here to the other side of war. Britain is again bathed in a kind of Italian sunlight of the kind that we certainly didn't see this summer. And again, it's one of those very famous views within Britain. It's celebrated culturally. This was a view that was made famous by poets, by writers. It's a celebrated view from Richmond, overlooking the River Thames as it meanders its way across the plain. But this was a particular game that Turner was playing here, we think, to attract attention from the Prince Regent, who would go on to become king. One of Turner's great irks in life was that he never achieved successful royal patronage. He came close a few times, but never seemed to quite meet the mark in the way that some of his peers did. This subject, with its title, England, Richmond Hill on the Prince Regent's birthday, with a crowd there in celebration of the Prince Regent, and we think that his arrival is imminent. There's all sorts of signs of a kind of patriotic, leisurely, joyful Britain. There's nothing negative about this picture. We think that this was painted with the king in mind, but it's also hugely indicative of Turner's channeling of the self-belief in Britain at that time. We look at the title. This view is standing in for the whole of England, which is quite a bombastic statement to make at a time when divisions were opening up within society. So it wasn't really as rosy and sunny as this picture would suggest. One of the things within the Homefront section that visitors will notice frequently is the men in their red coats. And there are various works here, including this one of Hyde in Kent, that we've included to show the continuing presence of the military in Britain, even beyond the victory at the Battle of Waterloo. So this was something that was very much a symbol of Britain's ongoing military might, the changes in the landscape that took place as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. Here we're overlooking a canal that was built for the transport of military provisions. So there are all of these continuing signs of the times in relation to war. I mentioned canal. The revolution in transport is, again, another ongoing theme of the exhibition. And it's, I think, one of the most peaceful scenes in the exhibition, but it's actually a scene of a lot of noise and a lot of industry and a lot of bustle. You have in the foreground a brewery being built right on the edge of the canal that would take industrial goods into Leeds. But then in the background, we have again a sign of centuries past in Kirkstall Abbey. So you have the ruined monastery of Kirkstall Priory next to the ultra-modern canal, and then the railroad bridge. So it's a real nexus of both time and different ways of crisscrossing Britain. And this is one of the works that you have in your exhibition that we didn't manage to get in ours. And it's, when I saw it within the list here, it did pull at my heartstrings, I have to say.
Yes.
It's an absolutely magnificent work, which I hope your visitors will really, really get close to and enjoy looking at, because there's so much detail, and I can't possibly talk about all of the significances within this, but I hope you might remember the initial view of Greenwich that we saw and maybe register the change in those 2 decades since that first painting was painted. You see that the number of ships' masts have multiplied into the millions. It's, you know, London is now just a sea of masts. It's a sea of prosperity, of shipping, of importance, where world goods and money converge. But then there's also a steamship, which registers the presence of the age of steam and new ways of traversing the British Empire. But it's a comment, and this is really one for your visitors to read about on your caption, but it's a comment about urban expansion and ambition, and really whether this is a good thing, and what gets lost when a city like London just grows and grows and grows. But I'll hand over.
It's beyond expansion. It's actually explosion of London.
Yeah.
The two paintings, the watercolor hangs just beside the oil painting of Greenwich, so you have a chance to compare them and contrast them.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah,
I'll hand over to David.
Well, we brazenly stole Tolstoy's novel title for this section, but it did seem to encapsulate what we wanted to do, because while the home front looked at what was going on within Britain during and after the Napoleonic Wars, and the sort of presence and implications of the war, of the military, of defenses, you know, things like military roads, barracks, and so on, for national defense at home, the extra provisions and supplies that the agricultural world had to provide for foodstuffs during the war when it wasn't possible to import, the implications of blockade that Napoleon caused on Britain, and so on. And then War and Peace really looks at the war itself, which means, of course, that the focus shifts beyond Britain to continental Europe. And then it looks beyond the war to, or at least how people were thinking of the peace that might ultimately succeed the war when it was over. And of course, that war lasted an incredibly long time. It began with the Revolutionary Wars with France that started in the early 1790s, and it didn't end until 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. And it was very far from certain that Britain would win. And although victory in 1815 paved the way for really a century of British hegemony globally, not just in Europe, the war also created enormous poverty, depression, an economic slump, and it created the impetus and demand for social change. But it's very important for Turner that the war tragic as it was, appalling as it was, terrible loss of life, it was also for an artist a huge opportunity, because in terms of the painting of contemporary subjects, the one type of contemporary subject for which there was really an acceptable tradition was the painting of battle pieces. Of course, you never painted defeats, but you did paint and celebrate victories. And so Turner seized those opportunities as they arose. But what we tried to do in this room, and I will keep these comments very brief, is to show a change of sensibility on his part from celebrating victory in the early years of the war to really questioning the whole idea of warfare and thinking about its tragic implications for ordinary people caught up in it, and also thinking beyond just a nationalistic or a jingoistic perspective, but to think about the victims of war on all sides. So there is a very great difference between how Turner painted the Battle of Trafalgar, which took place in 1805, and the way he painted the aftermath of Waterloo in 1815. But if we move to Trafalgar, that was, of course, both a victory, but it was also a tragedy, because Admiral Nelson, who had led the British fleet to the point of victory, was killed at almost that exact moment. And this is the subject of this painting by Turner, which Turner rushed through to finish in time for exhibition early in 1806. Having visited the Victory when she returned after the battle, she returned to Sheerness for repairs. She was very badly damaged. But when he visited the ship, there was still quite a lot of the crew, the Marines, the officers still on board, because they had not yet been paid off for shore leave, and he was able to interview them. And he filled a sketchbook with sketches and drawings and comments, really collected verbatim from these men who were still on board. It's absolutely fascinating. It's another of these little sketchbooks that Amy said you can hold in the palm of your hand, but which were absolutely crammed with a world of information. As well as making pencil drawings in the sketchbook himself, I think actually he got some of the men themselves to draw battle plans of the lineup of ships, because it would be much easier for them to do it than for him to describe to him and for him to draw from what they were telling him. So I'm not even sure that all the drawings in that sketchbook are by Turner himself. But there are portraits of some of the men. There are comments about them, that one of them had good legs, another had good teeth. Extraordinarily personal comments, really. Fascinating to read. And in that sense, that sketchbook is completely unique. But he also made a large drawing, which perhaps we can look at now, a large pen and ink drawing, which shows the state of the ship as she was at Sheerness, very badly damaged. He notes some of the damage in his inscriptions. A lot of the upper deck had been shot away. Most of the rigging and the masts had been taken down, although you can still see that there were some here. There are still a few of the guns left in place. But this is a ship badly in need of repair and reconstruction, which she received during that winter. And if we just go back for a moment to the Trafalgar painting, the result was this extraordinary picture, which when it was exhibited in 1806 in Turner's own gallery, which he ran at his private house in London as a kind of extra display space for his pictures, in addition to the Royal Academy, which is, a public exhibition. He exhibited this picture, which I think I mentioned he painted in a great hurry over the winter months, really across January and February, so that it would be ready to exhibit in March. And it was described by a critic called John Landseer as the first British epic picture, which was a slight exaggeration because other artists were attempting the same things. But what is extraordinary about it is the way that it has an almost filmic quality. It's as if Turner is hovering somewhere above the battle and a camera is panning over all the events. So we see high up in the rigging of a ship on the right, we see the French sniper who has just fired the gun that has killed Nelson. If you look up the mast, you will see a kind of flash of smoke, which is the gun going off. And then on the deck of the Victory, you see Nelson has been struck and he's dying, surrounded by Captain Hardy and his other officers. And then all around, the battle is continuing. And in that sense, it's really quite an extraordinary picture. So it's both a celebration of what became a victory, but it's also a reflection on the death of a national hero. And if we move on quickly now, in the same exhibition, he showed this picture, which is supposed to represent the Victory from 3 positions. So it's almost painted like a portrait of a person that an earlier artist like perhaps Van Dyck would have done, where you paint an individual from 3 aspects, both profile and full face. Here is the Victory seen from 3 angles. She's supposed to be returning from Trafalgar, but she clearly isn't, because it's very obvious that she's undamaged. The main ship is sailing in completely the wrong direction to arrive at Sheerness, and she's not flying her ensign at half-mast, which she was, because she was bringing Nelson's body back for official burial, pickled in a barrel of brandy. And none of this you would deduce from this picture, but it was painted for exhibition at the same show in Turner's Gallery, and I think its purpose was simply to show what the Victory would have looked like before she got to the state that we see her in the battle picture. So it's a kind of footnote, a kind of ancillary pendant to the main picture. And flushed with the success of his Trafalgar picture, Turner then went on to paint what at the time seemed like a triumph, which was the arrival of Portsmouth at Spithead of a flotilla of Danish ships that had been captured by the British at Copenhagen. And the government in London had got wind, incorrectly as it turned out, of a plan cooked up by Napoleon to incorporate Denmark into his empire and get control of its navy, which he would then use to blockade the Baltic to British merchant shipping. And of course, that couldn't be allowed to happen. So a British naval flotilla was dispatched to deliver an ultimatum to the Danes in Copenhagen that either they handed over their ships or the city would be bombarded. The Danes refused. The city was bombarded. It was a dreadful night. Terrible damage was done to the Danish capital, but the Danish ships were seized and they were brought back to Britain. At the time, this seemed like a triumph, and Turner must have thought it was a good idea to paint it. But unfortunately, very soon afterwards, it was discovered that the Danes had had no intention of joining up with Napoleon, and that the whole thing had been a ghastly mistake. And so there was a huge political backlash against this action, which was almost thought to be criminal. And the Lord Chancellor in London declared it as such. He was opposed by the Foreign Secretary, who said, well, we might as well launch an all-out maritime war. But anyway, one has to remember that throughout the Napoleonic Wars, there was a strong body of opinion within Britain that was anti-war and effectively pro-Napoleon, because it saw Napoleon as a force for modernization and progress, in the sense that he had restored and modernized France after the Revolution. So there was a lot of sympathy for the French cause within Britain. And that kind of mindset was very easily attuned to the idea that this action in Copenhagen had been a crime. And so Turner exhibited the picture again the following year in 1808, and he changed the title, and he took out all reference to the Danish ships arriving at Copenhagen, and he changed the title simply to Boat's Crew Recovering an Anchor. which of course is incredibly bland and non-specific. But what he either forgot to do or deliberately left in order to make the point without being too public about it, he did not remove the Danish flags from the ships. And I think at this point, his thinking about the war began to change. And that transformation continues. Just as Turner had made a point of doing kind of on-the-spot research for his picture of the Battle of Trafalgar, so in 1817, 2 years after the Battle of Waterloo, he visited the battlefield and made a tour, again filled a couple of sketchbooks with drawings, collected information, and he was also reading a poem by Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which contained a whole section on Waterloo. And he put his own impressions and Byron's writings together to make this picture, which was exhibited in 1818 in London. And it really isn't about the battle at all. It shows the aftermath. And what is so remarkable about it, and completely contrary to the way in which victorious celebratory battle pictures were normally painted, is that he shows the dead of all sides, the French, the British, all the various armies that fought at Waterloo. And here they are on the night after the battle, dead and dying on the field. Their loved ones, because after all, often girlfriends and wives traveled near or with their husbands as armies moved around, searching through for their loved ones. It's a deeply tragic and terrible picture, and it was much attacked at the time because it was not thought to be suitable. And I think this is an indication of Turner's increasingly humanitarian cast of mind and his refusal to be drawn into conventional thinking. And that leads us on quite neatly, I think, to the section of the exhibition that we call Causes and Campaigns. And this we have to look at fairly briefly because we don't have all the works in this section now that we had in London. But this was a time, the war, the Napoleonic War, had created an impetus for societal change and progress. And Turner was very sympathetic to those movements. One of the things that was going on was the movement to reform British politics by widening the franchise, by giving more people the vote, and by removing the historic privileges of the church, for example, and the automatic historic privileges of the aristocracy. And you could do that through taxation, by reducing tithes that were paid to the church, by widening the vote. And there was a long campaign for this, which culminated in what was called the Great Reform Act. And in this watercolor of Northampton, what we see is the triumphant election of a pro-reform member of Parliament, Lord Althorp, who is being lifted up and celebrated by this vast crowd. And of course, Turner turns into a very patriotic image with the Union Jack flying and so on, but also there are pro-reform banners flying everywhere, liberty and democracy forever. It's a wonderful thing. And, you know, the question arises, how political an artist was Turner? I don't think he was a political artist in a complete sense. We shouldn't see this as propaganda or as artistic activism or as agitprop, but rather I think as an expression of his broadly progressive sympathies, which didn't express themselves only in purely political terms, but in wider sociological terms as well. So if we move on, here, for example, is this extraordinary picture that I think in one way Turner painted as a response to Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, which he saw exhibited in London, which was a critique of the actions of the French government at the time. This is, we think nowadays, a picture of a terrible event that happened off the French coast, where a convict ship carrying female convicts to Australia was wrecked. And the captain refused offers of assistance from the French shore because he said, these were convicts. He was only authorized to land them in Australia. So he turned down offers of help. So a lot of lives were lost, the ship sank, and perhaps in a kind of natural justice, the captain himself was drowned. And so this is not political in a literal sense, but it does suggest humanitarian sympathies. This is a modern age we're living in, Turner's thinking. We need to modernize our thinking. We need to come up with a new set of values that matches the technological progress of the age. And I think a picture like this was designed to that effect, although perhaps he was advised that it was too terrible a subject for public consumption. So in the end, he didn't exhibit it. And again, this is not perhaps an entirely political picture. It's a spectacle, because clearly a dramatic fire reflected in the River Thames at night is a subject that no artist, and certainly not like one like Turner, was going to let pass him by. But it was seen, this event at the time, as a kind of allegory, an ending of an age, a purging, and a making way for a new one. Because here we have the Great Fire that destroyed the original Houses of Lords and Commons, a medieval building by the Thames, which of course is now replaced by Pugin's Victorian building. But the original building, which was full of rotten wood and so on and highly combustible, went up in flames. And this was generally seen as being a kind of natural postscript to the passing in this very building of the Great Reform Act. You're making way for a new political age. So the building in which old politics had been enacted was justly destroyed. And so this is both a kind of natural and elemental drama, but it has political connotations. I think at that point, Amy, steam and speed.
Well, this section really needs not very much introduction. This is one of the most evocative and, to use that word, iconic themes within an exhibition about the modern age as it emerged in Turner's time. And a few of these works will be very familiar, so I'll focus on the technique that Turner uses to really drive home the kind of impact on society that these new, modern, fast, really revolutionary forms of transport and engineering had on society. We see in this section so many steamships brought together. It was an icon that Turner really puzzled over and really worked out how to include it in picturesque scenes. He was really the first artist to grapple with that problem. And this is one of the images in which he was initially working out how to integrate this symbol of the modern world into a bigger landscape scene. But what I find really remarkable about this work and the series from which it comes is the technique in which that Turner uses. These are works on paper, on blue paper, and you really get that sense of vibrancy and a kind of electric buzz from that blue paper. And then on top of that, he's laid down some really vibrant patches of gouache, which is thickened kind of chalky watercolor. but to great effect, because you get that sense of the deep, dark steamship against that glowing sky. And again, with the ancient tower in Le Havre and the steamship, that sense of modernity coming up against history. But what was fascinating in terms of the modern age, these were works made for prints. And I think we really have to say how unusual these works on blue paper were for works made for prints. I often wonder what Turner's printmakers would have made of them. They weren't the standard fare to be given to a printmaker to translate into prints. They're really quite forward-thinking, visually arresting works, but nonetheless they were translated into prints, into coffee table books of Turner's annual tour down the rivers of France, the Seine and the Loire. And these were timed specifically to be released, ready for the Christmas markets. So these would be at that age of kind of modern commercialism that is so familiar to us today. Turner was very much part of that world. Now this is a gathering of works which I think David and I are very jealous of you having there in Fort Worth. We've gathered them on the same slide here to show the ultimate power of these works brought together. I need not say very much about them. They're all of images of steamships, a kind of symbol of both modern power, but also the frailty of human life against the elements. You have that really deep, ominous sunset in Stafford from the Yale Centre of British Art. Then you have the system in the central picture of flares being let up to signal when a steamship was in distress, or the steamship would go and rescue the ship that was running aground. And then the work from Tate, this kind of magnificent maelstrom with the steamship at the centre, this vortex that draws you in, for which Turner received some quite harsh criticism for his works. But of course, he retorted at the time that he didn't paint it to be understood. This was a painting that was all about feeling and about energy and about the sense of being caught in that storm at sea. And that's the work. It's I think the word iconic it's often overused, but I think it's really, I think we can apply it.
It's
here.
true in this sense that the painting is really a magnificent picture. And when you see when you see it nearby the staffa from 10 years earlier, you also see a remarkable shift in Turner's way of painting, which I guess is exactly where we're turning in this final section of the exhibition.
Indeed. So I'll hand over to David to introduce Turner as the modern painter.
Well, this is a wonderful connection, really, that extraordinary snowstorm, steamboat, harbour's mouth, to Turner's sort of late works at the end of his life, when his style really caught up with his subject matter. And he really is a modern painter, perhaps in the sense this time that Ruskin meant. Constable said that Turner seemed to paint with tinted steam. So it's almost as if Constable's saying he's painting the medium that is transforming society by all its sort of industrial and technological achievements, things which, of course, Constable himself never made the slightest attempt to paint, but which Turner made so central to his subject matter. And we see that kind of sparkling, misty, steamy atmosphere in Turner's paintings of Venice, which were some of his most popular at the end of his life. And one might wonder why pictures of a historic city like Venice, whose material structure had hardly changed for centuries, we might wonder what they're doing in an exhibition about Turner's modern world. But they are there really as a point of comparison, because at the time, Venice and Britain were often compared. They were both sea powers. They were both, or had been in the case of Venice, maritime empire. Venice's maritime empire on the decline, Britain's on the rise. And British energy and activity and hard work were often compared in the 1820s and 30s to what was seen as the kind of lassitude and decadence of Venice, which was particularly apparent after the city had lost its independence, it had lost its empire, it had been first of all invaded and taken over by Napoleon, and then after the Napoleonic Wars, it had fallen under Austrian control. And Byron wrote about that tragic effect in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and this is a painting illustrating Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the passage where Byron talks about the palace and the prison in Venice. And then to compare with this, a later picture that is really all about atmosphere, mist, light, reflection, and so on. And the way that these paintings are made in oil is now extremely close to the way in which Turner used watercolor in later life.
What we're looking at on the slide here is actually a really quite an unusual work on paper for it's one of the standout works on paper that you'll see in the exhibition. David mentioned about the confluence in Turner's handling of oil paint and watercolor, but here Turner uses a much more kind of gestural way of mark making in chalk and charcoal, and rubbing it in with his fingers and using wash to really get a sense. And the title gives you a clue of what's going on. This is a drawing of the whaling industry, of the act of burning blubber of a whale that's been captured. And it was made, we think, in preparation for a series of 2 sets of pairs that Turner made of the whaling industry. So here we've got a work from Tate and a work from the Metropolitan Museum combined again. And Turner was really seeking to appeal through these works, we think, to a patron who had a stake in this very modern industry. Elhanan Bicknell had a stake in a business that ran whaling ships and made candles out of the parts of the whale. And it's a territory that looking back through Turner's life, you could never preempt that he would then go into this icy regions. But he didn't go there, of course, himself. He went there only through his imagination and through studying books like the Natural History of the Sperm Whale. A book had come out just before Turner created these paintings that he studied, and through which he must have got a sense of what it was like for the whaling ships. But I think they're very, they're quite difficult works to look at, particularly the work in which you see the whale struggling, having been harpooned. They're very violent works, but they really do show those themes that we were talking about at the beginning of man's effect on nature, and really at this time, man kind of spreading out across the globe and really working the land and exploiting the landscape for the gain of modernity.
Turner painted a variety of subjects in the last few years of his life, and some are really pure landscapes, some look at contemporary political developments and so on, in industry, modern industry, as Amy's just mentioned with the whaling pictures. But perhaps the most interesting from the point of view of this exhibition are the pictures in which he seems to be, as it were, summing up many of the things that had happened across his life, and which he had painted in the past, or that had made an impression on him in the past. And this pair of pictures, exhibited in 1842, are really, I think, both of them, not just one, reflections on the life and afterlife of Napoleon. In the Exile on the Rock Limpet, so-called, Napoleon is seen in captivity, under guard by a British redcoat on the island of St. Helena, where he'd been sent for his second exile and where he ultimately died. And then on the right, we see a burial at sea, which Turner exhibited with the idea that it was a memorial to one of his fellow artists, David Wilkie, who'd been buried off Gibraltar after falling ill on a ship on which he was returning from a visit to the Holy Land. But I think that actually this picture started life as something quite different, because Napoleon died, as I say, on St. Helena. His remains stayed there for quite some time, but eventually the French king, Louis Philippe, decided that it was time to repatriate Napoleon, to bring his remains back from St. Helena and bury them in Les Invalides in Paris, that he should resume his place in French history. And I think a much better pair to the exiled Napoleon in captivity would be a painting of the collection of Napoleon's remains from St. Helena. And of course, it would be very easy for Turner to add the Rock of Gibraltar in the background. And I think he started painting it as another Napoleonic subject, but then when the news arrived in London of David Wilkie's death, he thought, gosh, you know, another major artist, a friend of mine, a Royal Academician like myself, he deserves a public memorial. So I'll change the subject. I'll put the Rock of Gibraltar in the background because Wilkie was buried off Gibraltar, and I'll turn this into a memorial to Wilkie. But actually, if one looks carefully, the coffin that is being that is seen by lamplight alongside the hull of the ship, it's being raised rather than lowered. And Wilkie was not, you did not bury at sea in coffins. The coffin is being brought from St. Helena and loaded onto the ship. So I'm convinced it's Napoleon. But that's by the by. The main point of these is that these make a wonderful conclusion to Turner's activities as a modern painter of the modern world right across his life. And also, of course, to two of the great themes: warfare, the terrible impact that Napoleon had had across Europe for many years before his ultimate defeat. And then, of course, because his remains were collected from St. Helena by steamship, Turner is also able to reprise one of his favorite subjects of a steamboat, seen here at night with black sails to indicate the sort of tragic gloom of this situation. And when somebody said, well, you can't use black, you know, serious painters do not use black, Turner said, I only wish I had color to make them blacker. So these paintings are a wonderful sort of reprise of Turner as a painter of the modern world, and also reprising his own work and his place in that world.
They are, in fact, the conclusion of Turner's modern world in our galleries in Fort Worth, and they offer us a perfect conclusion to our discussion this today of Turner's fascination with the modern world and your making of this exhibition and the ideas that inspired David and Amy to create Turner's modern world, this fantastic exhibition. You will be able to go to kimballart.org to see a virtual tour of the exhibition and walk through yourself if you're not able to come to Fort Worth to see the exhibition. If you're, for instance, viewing us here from abroad, you can in fact go to kimballart.org, the museum's website, and in the section of the website devoted to Turner's modern world, you'll find links to not only this talk, but others, and to the virtual tour of the exhibition, in which you can see the beautiful exhibition that David Brown and Amy Concannon conceived in London and which they shared with us here in Fort Worth. I can't thank you enough for your participation today, David and Amy. And we will look forward to celebrating this wonderful project again when we see each other, and may it be soon. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
It's really great. And thank everyone for listening, and tune in soon for more information about Turner's Modern World. Thank you.